When did the Old West begin, and when exactly did the Old West come to an end? This is a great question that I've probably spent way too much time contemplating, but unfortunately, I don't think there's an answer. In all actuality, the Old West or the Wild West, whatever you want to call it, it's really more of a concept than a defined historical time period. For me, just as a very fast and loose definition, I oftentimes think of the Old West as being everything that occurred west of the Mississippi River during the 19th century. That covers the mountain men, the wagon trains, the Indian wars, the cowboys, all that good stuff. But like I said, that's a very loose definition. Truth is, people have been migrating west and living on the frontier pretty much ever since the Pilgrims first arrived. I mean, at one point, Ohio was considered the frontier. And if you think about it, there's not a lot of difference between Daniel Boone hunting in the forest of Pennsylvania in the 1750s and Jim Bridger trapping for beaver in Montana in the 1830s. They were both operating in what was then considered the frontier, completely self reliant, cut off from so called civilization, and surrounded by indigenous tribes who may not have always been that friendly. I think for most people, though, if you were to randomly ask like 100 people on the street, what do they envision when they think about the Old West? 99% of the time, they're going to say cowboys. And if that's the case, then we're talking about a very, very brief period, just a little over 20 years. The long range cattle drives didn't start in earnest until after the Civil War, and by the late 1880s, they were pretty much a thing of the past. Did cowboys exist prior to the Civil War? Absolutely. Yes, they did. Mexican vaqueros go all the way back to the 16th century. There were ranchers in Texas who drove herds to places like Louisiana and Missouri in the 1830s and 40s. Later on, they do the same thing as far west as California just to feed the prospectors. Hell, there was even a guy in 1853 who drove a herd of Texas Longhorn all the way to New York City, which, if I'm not mistaken, remains the longest cattle drive in all of American history. That said, it wasn't until after the Civil War when the surplus of cattle in Texas, coupled with a high demand for beef up north, created what we now think of when we discuss Old West cowboys. Now, me personally, I do think that the Louisiana Purchase is a much better starting point when you're trying to figure out where it all began, at least when it comes to people of European descent, right? I mean, that's really when the westward expansion was kicked into overdrive. First with the mountain men, then the explorers, followed quickly by the migrants and wagon trains. But then again, there's also an argument to be made that it started much earlier with the introduction of the horse. I mean, if we're talking about the Old West, it really doesn't get much more iconic than a mounted plains warrior. Tribes like the Kiowa or Lakota, dressed in all their finery with their feathers and painted ponies. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the tribes that we now consider synonymous with the Old West, i.e., the hunter-gatherers of the Great Plains, they didn't acquire horses until around the early to mid 1700s. If you were to go back in time 500 years ago, you would not be able to locate a single solitary Comanche living in what's now Texas. And at that same exact time, the Cheyenne were still in Minnesota, farming rice. The Pawnee resided in the lower Mississippi Valley, the Crow in modern-day Ohio, and tribes like the Lakota and Arapaho were still living near the Great Lakes. It wasn't until they got their hands on horses that they were able to push west onto the prairie and start chasing bison. And in doing so, they displaced other tribes who were either less numerous or, in many cases, not as well armed. That's another thing. Right about the same time that they acquired horses, they also started trading for firearms. A lethal combination that completely transformed the western portion of what would soon become the United States. So when did the Wild West really begin? It really just depends on what you mean when you say Wild West. If you're talking about cowboys like you see in movies like Lonesome Dove or Open Range, it didn't start until after 1865. If you're talking about the frontiersmen like John Colter or Hugh Glass, you can take it all the way back to 1806. Or if you really want to pin down when things started changing, you're looking at the introduction of the horse in the early 18th century. Now, as to when the Old West came to an end, I do think this is a little bit easier to answer, but at the same time, there's still not a definitive answer, if that makes any sense. Some people point to 1890. That's the year that the U.S. Census Bureau famously declared that the frontier no longer existed. Quote, up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier settlement. But at present, the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. In the discussion of its extent, its westward movement, etc., it cannot therefore any longer have a place in the census reports. End of quote. In other words, everything was already settled. for the most part. That's also the same year as the massacre at Wounded Knee, which was also the last big clash between the Indigenous and the U.S. Army. The buffalo were gone, the entirety of the West was dotted with barbed wire and railroad tracks, and the natives were on the reservation, at least what was left of them. But be that as it may, there were still certain areas that remained wild long after 1890. Take El Paso, for example. That's where John Wesley Hardin was killed, a full 5 years after the U.S. Census declared that the frontier was the thing of the past. It's also there in El Paso where Hardin's killer, John Selman, was himself gunned down in 1896. And then the guy who killed Selman, George Scarborough, made it all the way to the year 1900 before being killed while investigating horse theft over in Arizona. Hell, Deacon Jim Miller was still assassinating folks up in Oklahoma all the way up until 1909. And then when he got busted, a mob dragged his ass out of jail and strung him up from the rafters of a nearby livery stable. 1909 and criminals were still getting lynched by vigilantes. I'd say that's pretty Wild West. This next little tidbit of information, though, is really going to blow your mind. And it's also probably one of my favorite stories to share in regard to the Old West. Any guesses as to when the last Apache raid occurred on U.S. soil? Let me see a show of hands. Anyone? Bueller? If you said 1924, go ahead and give yourself a pat on the back. That's right, 1924. Geronimo may have surrendered in 1886, but apparently not all of his kinsmen followed suit. Rather than submit to the reservation, a small contingent of Apaches drifted south into Mexico and hid out in the Sierra Madres. And it's there where they'd remain for at least the next 4 decades. They would, however, occasionally leave the safety of the mountains to conduct raids, like in 1924 when they killed a cowboy in southwestern New Mexico. They then pushed west into Arizona, Cochise County, where they stole some mules and horses before vanishing back south of the border. Once again, this was 1924, okay? Not 1870, 1924. And that also wasn't the end of it. A few years later, that same bunch murdered the wife and child of a Mexican rancher named Francisco Fimbres. And in response, Fimbres led an expedition into the mountains to wipe them out. And they were partially successful. He and his men killed and scalped whatever adults they could find, which were mostly women, and placed the children up for adoption, the last of whom was still alive in the 1970s. This is all true, by the way. I am not making any of this up. If you'd like to learn more, I do have a full episode dedicated to these Apaches, oftentimes referred to as the Bronco Apaches, and I will drop that link down in the description. Now, there was another Apache named Jason Betsinez. I don't know his birth name, but that's what he called himself later on in life, and he actually rode with Geronimo when he was a young man. Mr. Betsinez lived a very long time and published a book a year before his death in 1959 titled I Fought with Geronimo. And according to him, there were still free and wild Apaches living in Mexico as late as the 1950s. As to how true that is, I haven't got a clue, but it does help illustrate just how wild certain areas remained long after the so-called Wild West was declared a thing of the past. And yeah, that's my long-winded way of saying it just depends. Dodge City and Tombstone may have been tamed by the turn of the century, but there were still stagecoach robberies as late as 1916. And if you took a wrong turn south of the border in the 1920s or 1930s, you had a very real chance of getting your hair lifted. I'll tell you what this reminds me of. It's sort of like the debate as to what constitutes a Western movie. I think we can all agree that movies like Tombstone or 3:10 to Yuma or The Searchers even, these are all clearly Westerns. But what about Quigley Down Under? I mean, I personally would consider it to be a Western, but then again, it didn't even take place in North America. Or what about these so-called neo-Westerns like No Country for Old Men and Hell or High Water? Are they Westerns, or is that just something different? What about The Last of the Mohicans or Blazing Saddles? Is that a Western or a comedy? Is Legends of the Fall a Western? And if it is, what about A River Runs Through It? I mean, they do both basically take place during the same era and roughly the same location. Hell, there are even some people, like one of my favorite authors, Stephen Pressfield, who think that samurai movies and even post-apocalyptic movies like Mad Max should also be classified as Westerns. He pretty much defines a Western as any story involving a solitary man or a hero with a code. I'm not sure if I agree, but I do think that's also a great way of looking at when the Old West began and when it ended. Like I said earlier, I do think it's more of an idea or a concept as opposed to a defined period of time or even a location. Now, what you just heard was a question posed on YouTube by listener Browncoat Gunslinger. So thank you, Mr. Gunslinger. And if the rest of you don't mind, I thought I'd go ahead and open up the rest of the show to a few other questions and comments. Some of these are from YouTube, some are from Spotify, and I even have an email in there. Also, if you end up liking this, just let me know and I will do some more Q&As in the very near future, possibly even next week. So drop those questions down below. All right, so this next question comes from my man Plymouth Duster, longtime listener, asking, do you ever plan on doing any videos on Bell Star or Texas Jack Omohundro or the Rufus Buck Gang? And yeah, the answer to all three of those is definitely yes. I've actually already started on the Bell Star script, but these things just take time, man. I'll tell you what, though, I haven't personally read it, but I've heard a lot of great stuff about the book Texas Jack, America's First Cowboy Star by Matthew Kearns. I've spoken with Matt a teeny tiny little bit in the past, and I am familiar with some of his other work, which was excellent. So if you're looking to learn more about Texas Jack in the meantime, then I'm pretty sure Matt's book will help to scratch that particular itch. Dylan over on Spotify had this to say in regard to Billy Dixon and his so-called shot of the century. Not saying it's impossible, it is 100% possible. However, at 1,500 yards, with an average velocity, 57 cartridge, you would have had to aim 63 feet above your intended target. With the right rifle sights and shooter, possible, but damn. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Damn indeed. I think Dixon's skill with a rifle is what brought him close to his target, but I think luck is what helped him hit the target, if that makes any sense at all. It was like 95% luck and about 5% skill. I was actually recently trying to envision what it would be like to shoot at something at 1,500 yards. It's rifle season where I live, and I'm lucky enough to have a cousin who lets me hunt on our property. And when I say property, it's a cow pasture, okay? But there is a high line in the distance, so I'm able to see pretty far in this one specific direction. And even with a scope, I don't think I can see 1,500 yards, much less hit a target that far. But hey, then again, I'm not a sniper. I just don't understand how Dixon or anyone else could make a shot like that without luck, especially considering that he wasn't using a scope. I'm not saying that Dixon wasn't skilled. He absolutely was, but luck most definitely played a role. Okay, next we have Chris on YouTube chiming in with a question about John Miller. I agree that Brushy isn't Billy, but what about John Miller? From what I've read, there's a few coincidences that line up with him possibly being Billy, like not being left-handed when everyone thought Billy was a lefty. He doesn't appear in history books until his own wedding, a couple of months after Billy was supposedly shot. I read he also had a gunshot wound when he was at his own wedding. He's an interesting possibility. I'd love to know what the evidence is against John Miller. Cheers. Great question, and cheers right back at you, my good sir. And by the way, for anyone who's not familiar with John Miller, he's another one of these guys who claimed to be Billy the Kid later on in life, just like Brushy Bill Roberts. I've done a little bit of digging into Miller, not a lot, but a little. And from what I can tell, he's basically Brushy Bill Roberts 2.0. A lot of the sources either seem to be second or third hand accounts or just completely anecdotal. I'll give you a great example. There was this one guy, Herman Tecklenburg, who claimed that he first arrived in New Mexico as a teenager in 1869 and that later on he became acquainted with Billy the Kid over at Fort Sumner. According to Tecklenburg, Garrett shot the wrong man and John Miller was indeed the real Billy the Kid. There's just one problem. While it's true that Herman did immigrate to New Mexico from Germany when he was a teenager, it was in 1884 as opposed to 1869. So if he wasn't even in North America when the historical Billy the Kid was allegedly killed, then how could he possibly know if Miller was the real Billy the Kid? And Tecklenburg wasn't the only one. A lot of people came forward saying that Miller was Billy the Kid, but much like with Brushy Bill Roberts, none of these people actually knew the real historical kid. They were just people that Miller knew, sometimes even his own neighbors who just bought into his tall tales. Now, one of the things that you mentioned, Chris, is that he never claimed to be left-handed, which, okay, but he did say other stuff that was clearly taken from books, like the claim that he killed his first man when he was 12 years old after the guy insulted his mother. This is a very common misconception regarding Billy the Kid, and you can find the exact same claim in the widely popular book, The Saga of Billy the Kid, which was published in 1926. It's in George W. Coe's Frontier Fighter, and if I'm not mistaken, you can even find it in Pat Garrett's The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. The idea that Billy killed his first man at the age of 12 is just something that a lot of people sort of accepted as fact for years, which is probably why guys like Miller repeated it. But thanks to diligent research and much greater access to the records, we now know that nothing of the sort ever occurred. I don't know where the rumor started. This may have been something that the kid told his friends just for the hell of it, but it is patently false. He never killed anyone when he was 12 years old. And the reason I bring this up is because this is something that most of the fraudsters, like Miller and Brushy Bill, this is something they have in common. They would take stuff from popular books and then act like they had some sort of a secret insider knowledge that nobody else could have possibly known. Brushy Bill Roberts did it, and apparently so did John Miller. And there's a lot of other stuff too, man. Like Miller saying that his mother was a Comanche or that his wife was Charlie Bowdry's widow, neither of which is true. Really, though, I think the history does speak for itself. At the end of the day, we have dozens of people who historians have identified by name who saw Billy's dead body at Fort Sumner in 1881. There was a coroner's inquest, there was a public wake, a public funeral, and not a single person who was at Fort Sumner on July 14th ever claimed that Garrett killed the wrong man or that Billy somehow escaped. Not a single one. And then, of course, there's the fact that Billy the Kid was literally never seen again. That's the historical evidence, right? But what's the evidence for Miller? From what I can tell, it's just rumors and vague stories about scars and small hands. I'll say one more thing, and then we'll move on to the next comment. But I just want to address another misconception, this one regarding myself, Josh. I am not trying to convince anyone that Billy the Kid was killed in 1881 or that Brushy Bill Roberts or John Miller are frauds. All I'm doing is looking at the historical evidence and just sharing it with you. History is not binary. There's always room for new discoveries. It's always changing. We're going to be presented with new information in the future. And when that happens, that will force us to look at history in a different way to sort of put the pieces back together. But as things currently stand, the evidence is overwhelmingly in the favor of the kid being killed at the hands of Pat Garrett. And it's not even close. Great question, though. And I'm actually really looking forward to covering Miller way more in depth in the future, if for no other reason than to discuss the absolute circus surrounding his 2005 exhumation. Matthew Benjamin over on Spotify had the following to say about the recent episode I did on the top 10 gunfighters. I think Jeff Milton should be added to the list. He has 8 confirmed kills. Last one in 1900 with 3-finger Jack Dunlap. He's definitely overlooked and was skilled with a firearm. I agree, and I'm also looking forward to covering Milton at some point in the future. Matt, I don't know if you subscribe to the 100% free Wild West newsletter, but I did recently do a little write-up on Milton that you might find interesting, especially if you're a fan of Louis L'Amour. But yeah, I agree 100%. Milton was most definitely the real deal Holyfield. May have been a little corrupt, but either way, I do look forward into doing some digging. And by the way, there were a few people who apparently didn't hear the part on that episode about the top 10 gunfighters, where I stated more than once that this was all in good fun and it was not meant to be any type of definitive list of the deadliest gunfighters of all time. It was basically just an excuse for me to talk about some of my favorite characters from the Old West. So if your guy or gal did not make the list, don't worry, there are more lists to come. Turn Off the Pingus from YouTube, interesting name, asks, what are your top 5 songs, albums, music that you listen to? Top 3 works too. Even though I can picture you listening to Marty Robbins' Gunfighter Ballads on repeat, I'm guessing you listen to other stuff too. Thank you for all that you do. Well, thank you right back. Turns Off the Pingus. But yeah, I do enjoy me some Marty Robbins. But if I had to pick my top 5 albums of all time, I'm going to go with Johnny Cash's Live at Folsom Prison, Roger Allen Wade's DeGuayo Motel, The Meanest of Times by the Dropkick Murphys, Operation Ivy by Operation Ivy, and we're going to close things out with another Johnny Cash album, his first Americana album. Got a similar question from Viva Sepultre, or whatever that word is. Which punk bands do you like? You mentioned listening to it growing up. Yeah, I have an older brother, so I was pretty much listening to whatever he was listening to when I was a little kid. Sometimes it was stuff like Anthrax or Gore. Sometimes it was old 80s hip hop. And sometimes it was punk rock. So to answer your question, I got really into punk rock when I was around 13 or 14. And back then, I was listening to everything from Green Day to the Dead Kennedys. But my favorites of all time are probably going to be, once again, the Dropkick Murphys. I love me some Dropkick Murphys. I really like Screeching Weasel, Less Than Jake, Operation Ivy, Good Riddance, and Social Distortion. I listened to a lot of different bands back in the day. Older stuff like Minor Threat and Youth Brigade, The Descendants, newer stuff, and when I say newer, I'm talking about the 1990s, but stuff like NoFX and Rancid. But the ones that I just mentioned a second ago, Good Riddance, Social Distortion, Operation Ivy, yada, 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 those are the ones I listen to the most, and they're still the ones that I listen to even to this day. Matter of fact, I was just listening to Less Than Jake when I was taking a shower earlier. Fuquay Steve asks, if you have seen Old Henry, is it worth watching? The teasers look good, but that is to be expected. Yeah, I'd say it's worth watching. It's not something I'd put on a regular rotation. I'm honestly not even sure if I'd ever watch it again, but it's not horrible. I do think it would have been better if they didn't go with an actual historical figure. If they had gone more like the Unforgiven route, where Clint Eastwood's character was a fictional outlaw who sort of got dragged back in, I think it would have been better. But then again, I know a lot of people like Old Henry specifically due to the historical angle, so take my opinion with a grain of salt. I say give it a watch. Why not? Another question that I've gotten a lot recently is whether or not I've seen the new Billy the Kid series. And the answer is no. I don't even know what channel it's on, man. I'm sure I could probably stream it, but I don't know. I don't think I'd enjoy it. I've seen a couple of clips on YouTube. I saw the trailer for the most recent episode, and I don't know. It just doesn't seem like my cup of tea. I don't want to bash the show. I'm sure it's great. I think everybody should watch it if they're interested in Billy the Kid and they love watching Westerns. But for me personally, right now, it's just not for me. And to tell you the truth, I really don't watch many Westerns in my free time nowadays. I'm reading or writing or thinking about the Old West all day, every day for my job. So when I do get a chance to unwind, I want to focus on something completely different, which usually means just mindlessly scrolling YouTube or Netflix. Damien asks, Josh, how do you come up with your video ideas? Furthermore, is there one video you planned on doing, but during research found that it may not make a good video? Well, Damien, I usually go wherever the spirit leads me. I try to strike a balance between talking about stuff that I want to talk about with the stuff that you, the listeners, have requested. And full disclosure, there are some topics that a lot of people have asked for that I just flat out do not find interesting. It's not that I don't think they wouldn't make a good episode, but I personally just can't get in the right headspace to do the certain topics justice. If I force it, which I have done in the past, then I do think the lack of enthusiasm comes through to you, the audience, and it just makes for a bad experience all the way around. As to whether I've stopped researching just because I thought it would make a bad video, not that I can remember, but I have given up on certain topics due to a complete lack of credible information. That's why it took me such a long time to do stories on guys like Pistol Pete Eaton or Jack Henson, the Confederate sniper. There's just not a lot of information, and what little I could find was highly suspect. Or sometimes it's due to a lack of demand. Remember a few months ago when I decided to redo the series on Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce War? I was actually really excited for that. Ended up putting out 2 episodes, and they tanked badly. Like, those were probably 2 of my worst performing episodes in a very long time. So I just went ahead and moved on to something else. I do hope to finish the series, probably sometime in 2026. A couple people have emailed me asking about it. But when something performs that badly, it just tells me that the audience is not interested. And part of my job entails keeping you, the audience, happy. Sort of ties into what I said a minute ago about trying to strike a balance between stuff that I want to talk about and stuff that you want to hear about. Most of the time, though, we are on the same page. Not always, but most of the time. Martin asks, I come from Cowboys and a president, Younger and Hayes. Would there be any connection between the two? Boyers is also in blood. I already asked ChatGPT. It says there is none, but I believe so. Well, Martin, that might be something you'd want to consult a genealogist about. I'll tell you this much, though. ChatGPT and pretty much all of the large language models, or whatever you call them, whether it's Claude or Grok or what have you, I think people really overestimate what they are and what they're capable of. And when it comes to history or even genealogy, they are absolute hot garbage. All ChatGPT does, I have a very hard time saying that. All GPT does is it just searches the internet for you, but you have to give it very specific parameters or prompts for it to work properly. And even then, if it can't find an answer, it'll just make one up. There was an article published in The Guardian I was reading just this morning where they found the likelihood of false information from ChatGPT and similar AI models was 35%. In other words, over a third of what you're getting from ChatGPT is a total lie, or as they like to call it, a hallucination. Now, what you might want to do is check out your local library. I know they're not all the same, but there's a library near me that has its own genealogy department. You can access ancestry.com for free. They'll help you look stuff up. They have a ton of books on like specific counties and even families. Your mileage may vary, but hey, it might be worth checking out. A lot of really cool stuff at the library that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. You can rent movies at the library. Some libraries, you can even rent tools, I've heard. And if you download the Libby app, you can get a ton of free ebooks. I love public libraries, and no, it's not just because of the sexy librarians, okay? Garrett Miller asks, do you feel like your life has changed for the better or worse since starting the podcast? This is an easy one. There's no doubt about it. My life has definitely changed for the better since starting the podcast. I don't even know what my life would look like right now if it wasn't for the Wild West extravaganza. I still have this fear of waking up and just finding out that the last few years have been some crazy dream. But yeah, I've always wanted to do something creative my entire life. And when I say creative, don't get that twisted. I don't look at myself in some douchey way like, oh, I'm so creative. I don't mean it like that. I used to play a lot of guitar when I was a kid. I used to draw a lot. I used to fantasize about writing books or being a writer for a TV show. But as it turns out, I am not good at any of that. And I'm also not very good when it comes to podcasting. So I do have a lot of imposter syndrome. There's no visions of grandeur or self-delusion. To this day, I still feel like this show is pure amateur hour. I'm not supposed to be doing this. I don't feel like I'm qualified or talented enough to be doing this. But here I am, somehow by the skin of my teeth and the hair of my nutsack, I have managed to turn this into a full-time gig. And yes, to answer your question, it has made my life much better. I'm my own boss now. That comes with its own set of headaches, but at least I don't have some asshole supervisor breathing down my neck. It's not even just that, though. Even prior to making this my full-time job, if you were to ask me the same exact question 3 years ago when I was driving a forklift, you would have gotten the same answer. It's hard to put into words, but I really do feel like this show has helped me become a better person in pretty much every conceivable way. So if anyone out there is listening or watching this, if there's something that you're passionate about, whether it's history or woodworking or, I don't know, teaching people how to play golf, whatever, just do it. Just go ahead and get started. You know enough. You can figure out the rest as you go along. Now, I'm not saying you should quit your job, and I'm also not saying that your passion is going to start making you money, but you got to have something to occupy your time. You got to have a hobby, and it should be something that you have to constantly be striving to improve. And in the long run, you will not only improve in whatever that thing is, but I think you'll also improve as a person. Anthony Garcia asks, is Fusco hooking you up or what? Probably not. What Anthony's referring to, of course, is the many, many times I have practically begged John Fusco, the writer and creator of Young Guns 1 and 2, to cast me as an extra in Young Guns 3. Look, I know for a fact, that he knows that I want to be in Young Guns 3. But I'm not going to pester the man, and I don't want any of you pestering him either, okay? Do I think it's going to happen? Probably not, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world. I'm still going to watch the movie regardless, and I'm still going to be a fan. John Fusco doesn't owe me anything. He's not running a charity, and he is under zero obligations to cater to some random YouTuber's whims or some random podcast or whatever the hell I am. He's under no obligation. Would it be cool? Absolutely. Is it going to happen? I don't think so. Nessie from Spotify coming in with a correction on Billy Dixon. I think you meant he passed in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, in the Panhandle. Not to be confused with Cimarron City, Oklahoma, in central Oklahoma, and is a long way from Cimarron County, Oklahoma. I don't remember what I said in that episode about where specifically he died, but yes, you are absolutely correct. Billy Dixon did pass away in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, not Cimarron City. And then later on is when he was reinterred at Adobe Walls. Listener K Rockstar, also on Spotify, not that happy with me. 17-minute show and you have 5 minutes of advertising. Are you trying to boost your product? Get with it. I'm about to stop listening. Your shows haven't been great lately. Yikes. Well, I gotta say, man, you're definitely in luck because there is a lot of great podcasts out there. In this day and age, in the year of our Lord 2025, almost 2026, I can't imagine spending a minute, much less 17 minutes, on something that I didn't enjoy. Whether it's a podcast or a movie or a book, whatever. Life's too short, brother. And I'm certainly not for everyone. I totally get that. So if you have to move on, you got to move on, right? Now, if you need any suggestions for new shows to listen to or maybe even audiobooks, please feel free to hit me up and I would be more than happy to point you in the right direction. James Hodges also chimed in on the Billy Dixon episode saying, I live in Stinnett, Texas, and have actually been outside of Billy Dixon's house down on the Turkey Track Ranch and stood right by where his grave is. Sadly, the fort of Adobe Walls is no longer there, but still cool to live in the area. I've stood in the approximate spot that Billy took his shot, and let me tell you, it's a long shot for sure. Great episode. And yeah, great episode. Well, thank you very much, James. You know, I was in that area back in 2022. Kind of. I was at Palo Duro Canyon, but I was on a pretty tight schedule and I wasn't able to drive the additional, 2 hours just to visit Adobe Walls. But from what I understand, just like James said, there's really nothing there anymore. However, if you're anything like me and James, it is still cool just to stand in the same place where history occurred. I remember the last time I was in San Antonio, I was able to find the location of the dance hall where Kingfisher and Billy Thompson got killed back in 1884. I'm pretty sure, I'm 99% sure I got the right location. Anyway, the dance hall is obviously no longer there, but it was still really awesome just to stand on the corner and just imagine what it was like, just to be there where all of that history went down. I've heard people say similar stuff about Gettysburg or even the Little Bighorn Battleground, and they describe it as almost being a spiritual experience. I don't doubt that one bit. John coming in with the following in regard to the episode I did on Clay Allison. But Josh, you didn't mention the naked grave fight. For shame. Now, what John's referring to is just one of the many stories regarding Clay Allison supposedly digging a grave and he and his opponent having a knife fight to the death on the inside of the grave. Loser gets buried. And the problem is, there's just little to no evidence that any such fight ever happened. I could have sworn I mentioned it, though, on the episode. Maybe not, but either way, there's really no evidence. I do think at some point, Allison got into at least one knife fight, just because there's so many stories about him killing people in knife fights. So there's got to be a kernel of truth in there somewhere. But I also find it very suspect that there's not a single eyewitness. There's no write-ups in local newspapers. Nothing that so much as resembles evidence other than some stories that we don't even know where they originated with. Great question, though, and I do appreciate you pointing that out. James, also commenting on Clay Allison, wrote the following, and I really like this one. I give this channel a listen and really enjoyed what I was learning until about the time I heard this guy refer to himself as Daddy. I'm going back to Legends of the Old West. Hey, man, you can't go wrong with Legends of the Old West. As far as I'm concerned, no joke, no exaggeration, Chris Wimmer is the absolute gold standard when it comes to Old West history podcast. So I certainly can't blame you. I think you're making a great choice. Excuse me, my fucking voice, man. Whatever I caught like a month ago, I am just now over it, and I'm still getting the lingering effects in my throat. Anyway, next we got Ernest telling me to blink, damn it. We've also got listener Joshua saying, LOL, gotta blink. And then over on YouTube, we've got Canella Master writing, I observe that you positively do not have a blinking problem. Thank God. You do have large eyes, though. Maybe editing is what makes longer blinking times. I'm back to just listening. Keep on keeping on. Thank you. And yeah, I've gotten a lot of comments on YouTube regarding my blinking or lack thereof. First of all, I do want to say this is all in good fun. Please don't feel like you're being rude making jokes about my blinking. And as much as I appreciate it, I also don't need anybody to feel obligated to try to defend me in the comments if somebody does say something about blinking. Canella Master is almost there though. It is partly due to editing. What you see here is the final product. And more often than not, the final product is only half, or actually, more accurately, a third of what I actually record. So if an episode or a video is 30 minutes long, that means I spend anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half just recording it. I'll prove it right now. Whatever timestamp this is on the final episode, I have no idea. I'm going to check real quick. I have been recording so far for 58 minutes. 59 minutes exactly. Okay, 59 minutes, and this is what you've gotten so far. I mess up my delivery constantly. I flub my words, I stutter. I decide at the last second that I don't like how a certain sentence sounds, or I find out that I can't physically pronounce a certain sentence because of my mush mouth, so I change my script on the fly. I cough, I get up to use the restroom, maybe my phone rings or I get a text message. All of that stuff ends up getting cut out. So what may seem like a constant, uninterrupted take, in all reality, it is many, many different takes, just all spliced together. Even sometimes the same sentence is several different takes that are all spliced together. So I think that's what Canella meant by editing. And yeah, that is definitely a factor. But I'm also using a teleprompter. It fits directly over the lens of my camera. So when I'm reading my script, just like I am right now, it looks like I'm staring straight at you. And apparently this is a common problem, as I have seen other people having issues with not blinking enough or not appearing to blink enough when they use a teleprompter. Even now I have to consciously to tell myself to blink just because I'm so focused on the words in front of me. So yeah, it's a combination of that and my videos just sort of being spliced together through the editing process that makes it appear as if I'm not blinking enough. In a somewhat similar vein, I got a very interesting email just a couple of days ago. I'm not going to share the guy's name because emails are private, obviously, but he made a very interesting observation. Hey, I'm a voice actor guy. You're perfect. Now change. You share the common affliction that cripples TV newscasters all over the world. When landing on a period, you often/always sing the same notes, a little pattern that kicks in whenever a period approaches in the script. There are others who have it way worse, but you do it a bit, and now you are aware. Remember to imagine you were talking to someone to bring it off the page. Calendar is unique approach. Kudos. Peace out. Thank you, unnamed voice actor. And this is also something that other people have complained about. So I knew there was a problem, but I just didn't know what to do about it or even how to pinpoint exactly what the problem was. So it was nice hearing from a professional, and I sort of have an idea of what the problem is now. So I am taking steps to address it and hopefully fix it. And look, this sort of ties in with the whole blinking thing. This is also why I am very welcome to constructive criticism, as long as you're not being an asshole about it. Whether it's the way I'm talking or even how I pronounce certain words, I want to be the best version of myself that I can be on this show for you, for the audience, and for my own career, okay? So stuff like this really does help me when it comes to just improving my delivery. Finch Williams over on YouTube says, just wanted to say I ordered and received the calendar, and it is way cool. The quality is better than I hoped it would be. Thank you for that, Josh. Hey, Fred, thank you for supporting the Wild West Extravaganza. And thanks to everyone else who's bought a calendar. It really does mean a lot. I've sold more than I was expecting to sell, so it's always a good sign. And by the way, if anybody watching this or listening right now, if you're looking for a new calendar for 2026 or just a stocking stuffer for a loved one, go ahead and head on over to wildwestcalendar.com and pick one up. Unfortunately, however, they do not ship outside of the United States. I didn't realize that until it was too late, but I will most likely be going with a different vendor next year, so hopefully it won't be an issue. But yeah, so far, knock on wood, I haven't got a single bad review on the calendar. The only negative feedback I've got that I will also be correcting next year is that I didn't label any of the photographs, and that's on me. I should have included that information. But if you do have the calendar and you're curious about any of the photos, I know there's a couple that may not be all that well known. Or if there's just someone you don't recognize, please email me and I will tell you exactly who they are. Okay, one last question. This one's coming from Joseph, and he just wants to know, what is my favorite drink of choice? Well, Joseph, it is usually either coffee or just plain old water. Cool, clean water. I don't drink alcohol anymore, but when I did, believe it or not, I really liked wine. Cheap wine, preferably out of a box. I like my beer a little bit more expensive, usually Guinness or Sam Adams Boston Lager, or anything other than Miller High Life. And I liked whiskey and vodka and pretty much anything else that would get me to where I needed to be. But that's all in the past. Like I said, nowadays it's mostly water or Topo Chico if I'm eating. I do love me some Topo Chico. Green tea on occasion, and several cups of strong coffee every day. No sugar, no cream, none of that fancy shit. Just hot and black, just like Pam Grier. And on that note, I guess that's about all I've got. If you want more of these Q&A type episodes in the future, please shoot me an email or let me know down in the comments. And if you've got a question or comment or a complaint you'd like to see addressed in a future episode, go ahead and drop that as well. All right, till next time, adios.